Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a long-time progressive community organiser and activist. Today, I just wanted to briefly talk about the American author Robin DiAngelo and her book, White Fragility, which has been a favourite among a lot of liberal literary circles for a few years now. In particular, I'd like to talk about how anyone meaningfully on the progressive left doesn't actually need to put all that much stock in her or it, respectively. For those who might not know, Robin DiAngelo positions herself as an anti-racism trainer, and she became an internationally recognised figure in the world of corporate HR training when her book, White Fragility, became a bestseller around the time the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests hit their peak. The white-collar, professional managerial world went crazy for White Fragility, largely because of what a load of hogwash it is. The premise of the book itself is that racism, particularly but not exclusively American anti-black racism, is a lot like a original sin just baked into the fabric of society these days. Alongside the book itself, DiAngelo offers to run anti-racism sensitivity seminars for a lot of high-end companies, provided they fork over a pretty hefty fee. That means she'll come into an office somewhere for a day or two, get all the workers together in one room, and lecture them about how they're all unable to absolve themselves of this sin. In case you hadn't already cottoned on from that brief description of her services alone, this is all part self-conscious grift and part pseudo-progressive HR nonsense, designed ultimately to benefit the companies who bring her in. I myself am militantly far left, and I'd argue way further left than DiAngelo and her ilk. And in fact, of course, I also think racism is bad. In short, while systemic racial oppression is a real thing, and it's important to understand why that is and how to try and counteract it, DiAngelo's book is not going to fix it, nor is it even much of a step in the right direction. To really get your head around why, you need to at least understand why this woman is popular and why her book exists. Because when people rightly criticize it, they're not just saying it's a bad book because the contents of it are poorly written or that it's wrong in a vacuum. The fault of White Fragility lies in what it represents. DiAngelo is simply the foremost name in a recent move towards racial justice literature within the wider professional diversity training industry. For decades now, especially within white-collar office-type jobs, there has been such a thing as an independent person a company hires to come onto its premises and essentially run a typically mandatory class over a day or two with basically everyone below management level in that location at attendance. Outside of running corporate classes, people like DiAngelo also usually do a tour circuit where they basically run the same sort of courses for members of the public to sign up for, provided they pay a fee or give a donation to attend. This sort of thing has been going on since at least the mid-1990s, and the diversity industry is a multi-billion-dollar concern that operates all over the globe these days. Ever since the Black Lives Matter protests started drawing international headlines more and more a few years back, the focus of this industry has pivoted to addressing white-on-black prejudice in particular. But over the years, the focus at various points in time has been on women in the workplace, or queer rights, or handicap accessibility. The basic idea is that there's always some sort of cause to write a dozen books about, give a few lectures on the topic of some sort of systemic issue that, seemingly more often than not, isn't even an injustice that directly affects the person writing it. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility seminars, and all like them by any of these corporate scolds, are purely cynical exercises, being performed for basically just one of three simple reasons. One, to build up the author's own reputation. It makes them seem like an authority in the field, and of course it personally enriches them. Sticking with DiAngelo as our example, anyone at all could have written the book that ended up becoming the latest hot new thing in the world of corporate sensitivity training. The reason she pursued writing the book herself is because she's a striver. Her interests lie solely in garnering a name and a reputable brand for herself. Robin DiAngelo was once competing for attention and shelf space with all the other two-bit authors in the white-collar affirmation sphere. But she's laughing all the way to the bank now that her books just so happen to be the ones that ended up floating to the top. The second reason these books get written is that the industry is already there to prop it up. After all, now a lot of other striving managerial types that are trying to bolster their own careers can do so by facilitating DiAngelo's nonsense. Every independent venue who hosts her, and every publisher or speaking outlet she ever signs with, and every bookstore that ever stocks her work, all have an interest in promoting her too. There is a top-down marketplace ready to capitalize off every popular author in this genre at every step along the way. The people running that marketplace have zero incentive to kill their golden goose by admitting that all this workplace sensitivity stuff is just corporate woo peddling and that the whole thing's a sham. But they also won't ever willingly concede to any substantive calls to address issues like racial inequity in any serious way that will cut into their bottom line. And the third reason, the reason why this stuff gets trotted out in the workplace in particular, is because doing so makes the companies that run it look a little bit better on paper. If you're a top-tier 1% Fortune 500 company or the like, and your PR reps get asked how you're combating global inequality, now you can honestly say that everyone in your corporation goes through mandatory sensitivity training every year or every 6 months or so. Of course, that doesn't really do a thing to fix any of the systemic injustices in the world at all, but it makes you, the company, sound better. It's good PR. Plus, even internally, the training and the courses become another little thing that upper management can use as a cudgel to get rid of anyone they don't want to keep on the payroll. Maybe your office is fortunately somewhere with enough employee protections that you can't just be let go for no reason. So now they can say you didn't seem to cut it at the most recent round of training, and if you try to claim wrongful termination or anything, on paper at least, a business now has a slightly plausible cover story for why you're fired. At any time, you can be dismissed with the line, "You flunked the sensitivity training." Up until this point, I haven't even touched all that much on what these courses and the White Fragility book is even specifically about per se, as in what the contents of the book say about race relations. That's primarily because what DiAngelo writes in them isn't all that relevant to the process I've described here, and two, it's all garbage anyway. I'll try and keep this brief, but just in case you were wondering what sort of argument White Fragility actually tries to make, basically DiAngelo has two big tentpole arguments. Firstly, that the differences of experience and everyday culture between white and non-white people in the West are so irreconcilable that the demographic binary of POC or not ought to be the most important, if not the only, axis around which you conceptualize relationships inside and outside the workplace. Secondly, the titular White Fragility is the notion that anyone who notices that the first thing isn't really true, and in fact is very unhelpful, can't criticize DiAngelo for being so reductive, or else you'll just supposedly prove her right. See, any white people saying she's full of baloney are just covert white supremacists trying to protect their position of privilege. And any non-white people saying that have internalized the white supremacy of the white people around them. DiAngelo really doesn't want to hear any critical feedback on her terrible book. But I'd hope that the genuine progressives out there will be able to see through that for just what it is. The whole white fragility worldview is a bunch of gotchas where no one can say DiAngelo is wrong, and no one can fix their conscious or unconscious biases permanently, but they can work on themselves by reading her book and taking her courses every year. And if you do read this whole thing, you'll notice that the arguments DiAngelo makes to support her two central theses are very poorly written, and a lot of what she claims about the psychology of white people in the West varies from chapter to chapter. Right at the start of the book, DiAngelo claims that white people, as a whole, don't see themselves in racial terms, as in, they have very little conception of being a distinct race. That's why an expert like her needs to come in and tell everyone what being white even is. Then, only a few chapters later, the book's claiming that all white people are supposedly now perfectly aware of their racial distinction and perfectly unified in working together to protect and uphold it at the expense of all other peoples on Earth. That's why an expert like her needs to come in and tell everyone to stop being so cognizant of their own whiteness. And as an aside, I just have to ask, if you really do think all whites are racist, is it really the best move to increase racial consciousness? Historically, in a time of declining mobility and less for everyone, all the wealthier, whiter people finding a racial identity does not bode well for everyone else. If actual hardcore neo-Nazis, the bad guys, were capable of thinking through their strategy more than one step ahead, they'd love the way she'd put racial consciousness back on the table and up for discussion in polite society for the first time in about 7 decades. It's almost like she's either really sloppily trying to cause as many long-term problems as possible, or she's completely indifferent to the consequences of what she's writing and saying. Anyway, if she wasn't just an obvious grifter, I'd say she's just a well-to-do white woman projecting her own angst and knee-jerk insecurity on the entire world with this thing. Because when you get to the end of white fragility, the big twist that I, for one, could not have seen coming is that, as it turns out, Robin DiAngelo is herself white. And considering the failure of the global capitalist class to give up anything more than tokenistic little signs of appeasement to the modern progressive movement on racial disparity yet, if a single person could be said to have materially gained from the Black Lives Matter protests, it's probably Robin DiAngelo, who's here to tell all the other liberal office job whites, on behalf of all blacks, that the only thing they should be doing is giving her money. I think Rachel Dolezal legitimately has better racial politics than this woman, because at least she, by all accounts, genuinely did a good job at running her local NAACP chapter. But, anyway, what can you, an average normal person, do? Well, first of all, I don't expect you'll ever want to read this garbage, or go to a class put on by DiAngelo or one of her underlings or acolytes, wherever in the world you may live or work. But if this stuff, or anything like it, does enter your workplace courtesy of someone high up enough in the totem pole to be making decisions, just remember, it's not here to improve you or better interpersonal relationships around the office. This book is a HR resource. It's one part tool to help managers stir up an office, and one part brochure for DiAngelo's other 3 books on the same topic. If it can do one good thing at all, it'll be possibly opening more people's eyes to the fact that your bosses hate you, and you ought to hate them too. By definition, any workplace employing you only does so because there's profit to be made for them off of your work. Training like the white fragility courses only exist to keep the workforce off of management's back, more or less. HR is never on your side. They'd rather pay the final boss of all white women to come into the office and scold everyone until they're compliant, rather than risk workers of all races getting along and realizing their interests are all largely the same, to begin bargaining collectively. Not to be too class reductionist here, but the meaningfully anti-racist practice really does lie in forcing management's hand on issues that affect all of the working class. This book is just a BLM-themed union busting that plays out like a self-flagellation group therapy session for anxious white-collar libs. I think people like this are legitimately some of the worst people on earth. They essentially decide to abandon any hope of standing up for workers' actual rights in favor of spitting right in the face of people looking for real change in order to line their own pockets at the expense and subjugation of their fellow man. You'd be completely right to say that all over the world, particularly in the US, racial minorities have been discriminated against in just about every way possible. Employment, housing, ability to vote, access to healthcare, the list goes on. And DiAngelo fundamentally does not want any part of the capitalist system which caused that all to happen to go away or meaningfully change. She is on the side of the system. That's why the HR department can always find these people during times of heightened social awareness of systemic injustice, like during the 2020 George Floyd protests. If, say, income inequity in the West were ever really addressed, DiAngelo might suddenly find herself materially on a level playing field, which for her would mean losing a lot. Unfortunately, most upper middle class striver types will completely abandon any pretext of supporting people who work paycheck to paycheck as soon as conditions seem to start becoming even the slightest bit tougher for them. More often than not, that's when we get people like Robin DiAngelo who choose to throw their lot in with the high-level corporate execs and real bourgeois interests and try to tamp down real working-class efforts to redress inequality by telling us we need to focus on their co-opted, play-pretend versions of BLM or workplace feminism and the like. Nowadays, the middle-aged white woman wants to talk to you on behalf of the manager. But, all jokes aside, I really do think you have to be one of the most ghoulish types of person imaginable to aspire to becoming a boutique HR department cog in the machine of office capital like this. And frankly, simply no one deserves to have to listen to this woman. If someone tries to tell you any of this type of nonsense, be it in the workplace or in an organizing space or even over the dinner table, tell them it's complete bull. Seriously, if your employer ever tries to funnel you into one room for a mandatory all-employee seminar, and they wheel in some overpriced seat warmer to tell you this garbage, literally just stand up and start letting them know what you think of it. Trust me, I for one have had to do this in the workplace before, and I have to say I didn't see any negative consequences come my way to voicing my disgust at it. When you push back against it, they tend to freeze up. They might even decide, retrospectively, that making the thing all-employee mandatory was a mistake, and might start letting people leave if they don't want to stay in the same room and just tune it out mentally. Hell, while you've got people's attention, it might even be the right time to let everyone know that the real best ways to build cohesion among employees, and even address those historic income inequalities, is to unionize. It doesn't matter what line of work you're in, as an employee, your interests are directly in conflict with your boss's. Your boss wants to get as much value out of you as possible and pay you the least. At the end of the day, DiAngelo and people like her aren't on your side. No one brought in by management ever is. Not cost cutters, not employee evaluators, especially not anyone who comes in to warn you about the perils of unionization. These people exist purely to protect management from liability and expense in the long run. If you're ever in the unfortunate position of experiencing a racial sensitivity workshop run by an out-and-out scam artist like Robin DiAngelo or one of her acolytes, just remember, it's because your employer thinks so little of you, they'd rather belittle you with hours of utter nonsense than ever own up to the fact that you and them have fundamentally different interests. And you should really hate people like Robin DiAngelo as much and as viscerally as you would hate any conservative commentator. It's just a line of thinking I thought you should hear. Once again, my name's Card. If you might want to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or just take a look through my older videos. Either way, bye for now, and have a lovely day.